I am thrilled to have you all in the room. It's so exciting to be here. As you know, this is the session on chronic absenteeism as a policy-worthy lever for change. And it's such a privilege and a pleasure for me to be here at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, their funders huddle, which I think we've been to every single one of the huddles. You know, one of the reasons why it is so helpful that I can be here is, the truth is, as some of you may know, attendance works, possibly this metric of chronic absence, would not exist without Ralph Smith and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Those of you may have heard this story, but I started working on the issue of chronic absence in 2006 when Ralph, as a senior vice president of the Annie Casey Foundation, had asked me if I would figure out whether we had any evidence or research that missing too much school in kindergarten and first grade is contributing to students not reading by the end of third grade. He asked me to look for whatever national data we could find, figure out why, what we knew about what worked, and that was the start of a journey that I had no idea would turn into my life's mission. As you all know, you gotta really be careful about little assignments from Ralph Smith. They have this way of taking over. And by 2010, and I will share that there was this argument for a while where Ralph said, I think you could become the national expert on this. And I said, Ralph, I wasn't looking to become a national expert on this. I was a mom looking for meaningful work as my kids were growing up, and this was kind of an intriguing issue. And by 2010, it was clear with the launch of the campaign that we needed a national initiative to help people really examine how chronic absence was affecting their own communities and what were strategies that they could take and do the work. So we became a national initiative. And from the very beginning, and at that time, we were solely funded by a grant from the Annie Casey Foundation, and there was a part-time of me in a communications firm. We've come a long way since the launch of Attendance Works in 2010. And part of what I think has been amazing is that we've been able to have a national presence. And I will tell you that in 2007, I actually talked to some policymakers on the Hill when I said, you know, I'm uncovering this metric that I think should be considered as a national metric for people to require maybe that states look at this. And the particular person I was talking with said, you cannot add yet another unfunded metric on the backs of districts and states. If you do that, you are dead in the water. And I'm like, maybe trying to move national legislation isn't the way to move this work. So what's remarkable is we went from me getting that kind of advice in 2006 to 2015, when chronic absence was actually included in the reauthorization of ESSA. It is under ESSA, it is a required reporting metric, and it is an optional accountability metric. And I attribute the fact that it's there to two things. One, if you didn't know, Attendance Works actually doesn't lobby. We believe that we want to be sort of this resource for people, but not seen in any kind of partisan way. So we do not lobby. But we do have friends who lobby. And our friends, particularly the Healthy Schools campaign, was heavily influencing what happened in the Senate around ESSA reauthorization. But equally important, for all of our years of existence, we've been working in partnership with the campaign. And as you all know, one of Ralph's incredible, astute strategies is to always make sure that things move out across communities, across red and blue states, so that it is seen as a bipartisan consensus. reading at grade level in 3rd grade, is, cuts across every kind of political aspiration, any kind of community. We all want that goal, right? Similarly, I think kids being in school so they can benefit from what's being taught is a bipartisan consensus. In fact, our friends who were lobbying in Congress at the time, we said, Hetty, we can't tell you how many meetings we had to have to not lobby. They said, we asked the Senate Help Committee, should we do anything? And they said, we're seeing a lot of places very supportive of this chronic absence metric. If you say something, someone might notice and they'll take it out. Don't say anything. So that was the strategy for lobbying around ESSA, the don't say anything strategy. In any case, we're now at a watershed moment. We are at a moment where we're trying as a country to transform the way we think about school improvement, right? So we're moving from No Child Left Behind, where success was determined largely by academic standards. We're moving into an era and an opportunity where we can not just look at success by academic standards, but we can think about what kind of non-academic standards and measures do we want to use. We had federal targets and interventions for schools, and largely what felt to, I think, educators as a punitive system of responses, right? If you didn't meet them, your whole entire school could be disassembled. Now it's about states setting goals, having a supportive framework from the feds with states having the authority to figure out what's going to work tailored to their own opportunities and realities. We maintain accountability and data for student subgroups, though there's some ways I think our data systems may allow us to do that in even more exciting ways. And under No Child Left Behind, that was the first time you really had truancy in No Child Left Behind, where they said, states shall define and address truancy, but it was left up to every single state to determine what that would be. And typically, truancy in this country it's been sort of more of an after-the-fact approach to working on attendance, right? Kids' attendance is so problematic that then we'll start to send them threatening letters, eventually maybe using a court, taking them to court, warning them that they could be taken to court. It was seen as sort of enforcing compliance with our state compulsory ed laws. There is some value, by the way, to legal action at some point in the process, but that's been more connected to truancy, and when we're shifting to now chronic absence, which is now a required reporting metric, and right now I think this is still under exploration, whether it's the 15 days in OCR or whether EdFax is actually going to be adopting a 10% metric. 10% metrics are actually in a lot of the ways in which states who have submitted ESSA plans have adopted this. By the way, Sue, please stand up for a second. Sue's our policy director. This is Sue's work of art. This is our table allowing you to look across all of the 17 states, whether they adopted chronic absence, and if they adopted chronic absence, what was their definition of chronic absence. The key, though, for us is that chronic absence is this opportunity to really move towards prevention and early intervention. It's allowing us to use the fact that kids are missing so much school to notice that something's wrong. And for Attendance Works, this is an opportunity to put in place, we think, these key ingredients of what we know are systemic approaches to making change for chronic absence, or for reducing chronic absence. You have to have positive engagement. Kids come to school when they know they're warmly welcomed, loved, when people are building relationships to them, right? You have to have actionable data so that you know when kids are starting to miss school, just 2 days in the first month of school, or the fact that they were chronically absent last year, so you can take action early on. You do want shared accountability so that we can all assess if this is happening and take action when it's not. But we're going to have to really build capacity to do this work, because many people don't necessarily know what is chronic absence. How do you take a comprehensive prevention-oriented approach, and we know that this is requiring a different kind of partnerships between the state and district educational institutions and community partners, because so many of the barriers and challenges facing kids getting to school require community partners, folks who can work on transportation, folks who can work on stable, affordable housing, safe housing. Health issues are huge. The resources for addressing those barriers are all not within the purview of schools. So what we have the opportunity to do for today's session is to explore a bit more, hearing from our panelists, what do we know about what's happening in states, on the ground, with respect to ESSA? And what insights does that offer you about the role that you can play as funders in making sure that we can use chronic absence as a means to advance third grade reading, particularly for our most vulnerable students who are in fact the most likely to be missing too much school? It is my pleasure to have this amazing panel of colleagues. I couldn't wish, in fact, actually the campaign allowed me to have some voice in trying to think about who I would most want to have on a panel with me. And so I think my wish list got fulfilled. You know, I'm actually gonna not do the formal pieces. I'm gonna just talk a little bit about how I know and what I love about each one of these panelists, although Tom and I have not had as much of a chance to meet, but I'm so pleased that you can be here as a local superintendent. And I also do know, particularly through Barbara O'Brien, about the incredible focus that you've placed on equity, using data to drive action. And so I know your insights as a local superintendent will be just so invaluable to us. And after Tom, we have Carrie Wright. Carrie and I got to meet, I think we had about a 2-minute introduction before we were in the part of the Senate House, your state building. It's this little alcove which I realized all the reporters were sort of sequestered in. And we were in the middle of the alcove with microphones being placed in front of us and asked to talk about chronic absence. And I realized I wasn't sure what Carrie was gonna say, and every word that came out of her mouth, I'm like, that's exactly right. And Carrie has been, moving into she's not from Mississippi, but her ability to work and go into a new environment. I'm so glad she has her board chair here. That's such a compliment both to Mississippi's commitment to this and to you, Carrie, bringing this work of chronic absence into the metrics that you look at. Candace McQueen. So Candace has heard me tell this story before, but my first meeting with Candace was I was at a state conference where it was with all of her attendance officers, and Candace came on the stage to talk to them. And the first thing I realized was these attendance officers had never had a state superintendent come and talk to them. They were thrilled. They were jumping out of their shoes with joy. And then when they heard her speak, they knew she understood their reality, their challenges, and how important it was to academic instruction. Candace, you've been so superb in moving your entire State Department on that, moving it across divisions and making sure that the people who are on the front lines working on attendance feel like they are honored and valued members of a team that too often people feel more like they're the forgotten members of a team. And then we have Charlene Russell Tucker, who I now don't even remember how I got to know you, Charlene. We've been working together for, I think, about 5 years now? About 7 years, longer. Charlene has been my partner in crime in Connecticut, where she has just exuded such leadership. Making, the thing that you'll know, and I'm going to just Connecticut is really our proof point state with 3 years of reductions in chronic absence by every grade, by every subgroup, and improvements in graduation rates. And that work would not have happened without Charlene. This did not start with ESSA and the implementation. The seeds that she's been planting, nurturing, and growing have been occurring for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, probably even longer before I met Charlene. So what a pleasure to have this as my panel with me today. Okay, enough of me. I want to shift to conversations. And my first question, and we're going to first start with actually a conversation among the state, and then we're actually going to turn to Tom towards the end to talk about how that connects to Denver. So I'd actually like, Carrie, if you would start off. Tell us the story about how chronic absence became a topic in your state in Mississippi, and what's really helped to advance an understanding and work on this issue?
So we are relatively new at this, and there was a lot of confusion when I was talking to superintendents around the state around the difference between average daily attendance, or ADA, versus chronic absenteeism. And I think what compounded that is ADA is a component of our funding formula. So superintendents were paying a great deal of attention to ADA, and as long as their ADA was high, they were good to go. And they just couldn't quite seem to get the chronic absenteeism piece of it. So my very good friend, Dr. Linda Southward, from the Mississippi State Social Science Research Center. She's also our state director for Kids Count. She's always been a good partner, and I said, how about if I turn over data to you? Could you run the data around chronic absenteeism, and we'll produce a report? Never been done. So she did, and it was rather alarming, and we reported out. We reported out by district and by school what the chronic absenteeism rate was. So the first call I got was from one of my A district superintendents who said, you've got this all wrong. There's no way that my high school can have a chronic absenteeism rate, this one high school, of 54%. And I said, well, you gave us the data. And he goes, what? And I said, no, these are data that we ran based on what you gave us as a district. Well, he was stunned. I mean, he could not believe, because he kept saying, but that the ADA at that school was at 95%. I said, I appreciate that. I said, but your chronic absenteeism rate is really high. So as I have been going out and speaking about this, and a comment that I make a lot of times to superintendents and to principals is, behind every data point, there's a face. So if you don't know who that face is, then you don't really know how to attend to that child's needs. And with Linda's report, there were two kind of interesting facts. One, I think everybody expected it to be students of color that were more prone to being chronically absent. That was not the case in Mississippi, which I think shocked a few people. It's white children that have more of a tendency to be chronically absent. And the other part of it was, we linked it back then to our third grade assessment. So we said, of those third graders that took the ELA assessment, knowing that we're looking for a reading on grade level by the end of grade 3, so the statistics that came out were that 53% of those children who had never been chronically absent were proficient in reading, versus the 60% of those children who had been chronically absent were well below proficiency in reading. So it was a way to tie the work back, because as I said to Hetty, having children in school is a good thing, but there's a reason we have children in school. We have children in school so they can learn. And so that was the whole idea around our thrust, and that led us to producing an early warning document for all of our districts, to bring attention to this, to talk about setting up attendance committees, to talk about looking at these data on a regular basis. And then more importantly, it's not just what do the data say, but what then do you do? So if you've got this list of children, it's not just enough to know that Carrie's been absent more than she should be, it's why is Carrie absent? And as Candace did, we've really tied our school attendance officers into this so that they can see that their role is really to get out and be working with families, home visits, Do we need to connect them to other resources, such as the health department or social services? But you can only do that if you've got everybody connected and focused on the same thing. So although we have not yet, and I'll talk about this if I get an opportunity, we're not including this yet in our accountability model because I'm concerned about, we don't have one information system for the entire state, so that's bothering
You know
me.
what, sorry, Carrie, why don't we get into that as we talk
Got
about
it.
the ESSA implementation?
Oh, perfect, okay. I'll turn
Which
over
we
to
will. And I'm going to shift to Candace to
Sure.
tell a little bit about your story.
Good.
So in Tennessee, we started with the reading challenge. So when I came into the department, it's been a little over 2.5 years now, we were making strides as a state in many areas. The graduation rate, 88.5%. We had progressed over 5 years, moving in the right direction. We have had remarkable growth in both math and science. We have been a state that, I hate to say this about Mississippi, we would say thank goodness for Alabama and Mississippi, because we were sitting down at number 47 and number 46 in terms of educational outcomes. On the nation's report card, we were sitting down there about a little over a decade ago. We're now on 6 different metrics and 6 different tested subjects and grade levels on NAEP. We are now in the top 25. That's remarkable progress over a decade. But at the same time, we were not having that same progress in reading. So the very first thing we looked at was, what's the problem? Let's start looking at the data. Why have we not had any progress? And we decided we would look at chronic absenteeism because we had had some connections back to Attendance Works through some version of our State Department divisions. So let's do a report. Let's do our own research on this. And we put out this great document. If you've not seen it, I'd love for you to go on our website at the department.
It's actually on the app?
And it's linked on the app. Fabulous. It's called Chronic Absenteeism in Tennessee's Early Grades, because we were trying to look at, is there a connection to reading challenges that we're seeing across the state? Great report, and this changed the conversation. This is well before we started putting anything in our ESSA plan. This came out in February of 2016. We put our ESSA plan out, a couple months ago. But it started a conversation around what the reality really is. And we see, particularly with our students that are economically disadvantaged, there is a compounding impact of chronic absenteeism. It's not the cause of them not reading, but it compounds year after year, and you start seeing that 28% of kids who are chronically absent are also not on grade level, right? So you see this combination. You have 44% of kids who are not chronically absent are on grade level. And so there is this huge gap, and you see it getting larger and larger as we were looking at grade level outcomes in middle school and in high school. So that started the conversation. We do know that it was a turning point for this conversation that we have with districts around ADA. We're at 95% ADA across the state, but when you look at chronic absenteeism, it's close to 14%. And we had a district, then I'm going to turn it over to Connecticut, who's been doing this a lot longer than we have, but we had a very particular district in Middle Tennessee, close to Nashville, that had a 31% chronic absenteeism rate. They've never been identified as with having priority schools. They are going to be identified as having focus schools on our next list, and we started looking at their data to say what is going on in this particular county, and fairly rural county, part of it's rural, and they just did not have a value on going to school. We've already started with multiple districts like that. I can think of a fourth of our districts who are in that exact same scenario with some campaigns, and I can't wait to talk about what we've already done on that front, talk about the value of school, and then what we're doing in urban districts, which is very different in some ways, and how we've tried to approach it. But the department is taking a very significant leadership role in talking about how this matters, and then doing things to fund things that are data-driven that we can move forward on, and then we have put it in our accountability system, and I look forward to talking a little bit about that.
Great.
Thank
Charlene?
you. So I'm going to try to put 7+ years work in a few minutes in terms of how we got where we are, but I must begin by saying that it was a personal, passionate belief that we can unleash the genius in our students by making sure that they are successful. And so without talking about or making excuses for their life circumstances. in 2012, we had the Bureau of Education Reform in Connecticut with a new governor, with more resources being placed there. We recognized that you cannot get the return on investment if the kids are not in school. And so fundamental to having conversation about great teachers and great leaders and rigor is the fact that, as former Secretary of Education, Secretary King says, that even the best teachers cannot find success with students who are not there. And so we started to look at our data, and at that point in time, 2010, 2011, we actually had the data as a part of our data system, but we were still focused on average daily attendance. And so with the research, the work that Attendance Works and others were doing, we started really our own reflection in the agency about, so what do we have for data and what is it telling us? We learned back in 2010 and 11, when we looked at the data points for attendance in ninth grade and graduation 4 years later, and we looked at kids who were more economically challenged, so kids eligible for free or reduced price meals, and we found that for those kids who were chronically absent, their graduation rate 4 years later was at 40%. The same students economically challenged with good attendance were graduating 85%. Now, to me, that's a clarion call for action. And so we really got moving in terms of reporting data. So back in 2010 and 11, we started publicly reporting chronic absence data. And if you stood long enough, I was going to talk to you about it. So it was about talking to our policymakers, of course, talking to our districts, talking to funders, talking to everyone about this is really an area that we needed to pay attention, because if we don't do that, you're not going to get the results that you're working for. And so we started reporting the data. And actually, so in 2014, we had the opportunity for ESSA flexibility request. And we started actually 2012 as well, and we put a placeholder there for well-rounded students. We know we wanted accountability measures that went beyond test scores. And so it was a placeholder in our first request. And in 2015, we actually included that in our next generation accountability system. So a chronic absence has been a part of accountability in Connecticut since 2015, and we actually have had 2 years of results around reporting out the results as a part of the accountability system. So by the time we got there, we'd already cultivated really a lot of partners around us, as I previously mentioned, to say that this is really important. We had reporters who were reporting on this. We wanted people to know what this is in definition. And fast forward, we actually, by our work with the legislators, the definition for chronic absence is in state law. We have a state law that also required district at a certain threshold of attendance to have school and district attendance teams. So we leveraged that work as well. And we're really thrilled, as was said earlier, because of the progress that we're making in that particular area. I'm sure there'll be more details I'll cover, but I just wanted to do that.
Charlene, can you, in Connecticut, there's been a parallel story of what's been happening at the state, but also what's been happening at local districts. Could you talk a bit more about what's been happening at the local districts around bright spots and best practices, and then how the state has leveraged that?
Perfect, thank you. And on the app, there's actually an article about what states can do about chronic absence, and in that, we talk about the 6 strategies that we believe are really critical for making this happen. To Eddie's point, though, and maybe for the people in the room, at the same time that the state was paying attention to what's going on, we had a local district, New Britain Public School, that because of work around grade level reading, actually got some local funds to start paying attention to this issue. So imagine as the state was trying to move this lever on a statewide basis, we actually had on the ground a school district that was making it happen and making things work. So we were able to then leverage that school district. New Britain was out on doing a lot of presentations to their peers, so to other districts, saying these are the things that we've done in our district, these are the conditions needed for success, and oh, by the way, you can do it too. So it's not just the state, looking down from our very beautiful ivory towers to say what's going on locally. It's the local district saying, and this is how we've done it. So with some local funding, they were able to do that work, and so we started working together. Our Committee on Children actually had, back in 2011, the Legislative Committee on Children really started to look at results-based accountability and the state of children in the state. and actually had a result statement about all children being healthy. Chronic absence was a part of that indicator that they worked on, so we leveraged that as well. But going back to New Britain, they were able to look at the state trying to move the dial, a district trying to get it done, and that particular, the committee formed a leadership committee co-chaired by our lieutenant governor to pay attention to our RBA results measures. And they actually formed a strategic action group on chronic absence, and I was pleased to be asked to co-chair that. It's still happening, that body, along with the attendance czar, is what I call him, from New Britain Public School. So we co-chair that effort.
And his name is Joe Vavricek, and he'll be at the end, he'll be here at, later here in the week.
So we were able, though, to show, here's the state saying this is what we need to do at the state level, and oh, by the way, here's a district that's actually get it done. So we were able to leverage that work together.
Thank you. So let's talk a moment. So we're going to come back to where you were starting to go, Carrie. ESSA implementation. How are you looking at chronic absence within that context? What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the challenges?
Well, we had discussed, as we were looking at other indicators, we had actually had a long discussion around chronic absenteeism. But my concern was not having one statewide information system. My concern was on data quality, and I wanted superintendents and principals and teachers to be focusing more on the attendance piece. So we definitely decided, obviously, because not only because it was a requirement, but we felt strongly that this needed to be a reporting factor. So we're identifying other factors that we are going to put on district and school report cards, and this is going to be one of those factors. Until I get, one system that I have confidence in, I don't want people to discount the information around chronic absenteeism by saying, well, the data just aren't accurate. We're going to have to revise, as all of us are, our accountability models anyway within the next 2 to 3 years because of the inclusion of English language learner growth and proficiency. So it's my hope that by the time that we get there, that we will have one system that we can rely on. Because the other thing that I wanted that system to be able to do, and a lot of states have this ability, is to be able to go in and look at just-in-time data, and we weren't able to do that. I would love to create an electronic early warning system for districts to use, and without the ability to do that, we fell back to the fallback position was, let's create an early warning guidance system for districts so that we could work with them on how you could at least get that started using your own data and using your own data locally. So we did put that together, and the feedback we've gotten from the districts has been very, very positive. I think people, the more we're talking about it, the more people are starting to really understand the difference between the two. And I think that that's where we're hoping with our ESSA implementation is to first use it as a reporting feature for districts and for schools, but then to be in the conversation when we revise our accountability model, as we're going to have to do anyway. I would love for that to be, there's too much research out there that shows the connection between absenteeism and student achievement for us to not really take advantage of that.
Thank you. Candace?
So we are using chronic absence, and we're actually calling our metric chronically out of school, and that was based on feedback that we got when we put our plan out in draft form, because technically we are looking at students who are missing more than 10% of the school year or 18 days, but that includes students who are out of school due to an out-of-school suspension. And so we wanted to be very clear on what that included, so it's called chronically out of school, and it includes those two pieces. The student who is just missing, plus the data that shows there's a discipline challenge in the students out of school, but for a suspension. So we're attacking this on two fronts. We're talking about why are they out of school, but also the discipline challenges that we see across some of our districts where our students who are African American in Tennessee have much higher out-of-school suspensions than any other student group across the state, and we have had that challenge for multiple years. And so we're using this as an opportunity to talk about both. And the challenges on that front have been interesting. I mean, one challenge has been immediately we will have some districts that say, well, you don't understand my situation. I have a really high-performing group of students, and they do lots of college visits. And so they're going to be out a lot for college visits. So we've got that on one side, and then we will have, you know, a rural county say, well, our challenge is we're really small and there's not a value necessarily to education, and so sometimes parents just take them out for no reason. So you'll hear that like, this is going to be a problem for me. Well, what we have said is that within our metric, it is about how you are defining, based on our state board policy, excused and unexcused absences, how you're defining absence. And within those policies, those local policy decisions, you're going to have to be very clear on the value of going to school and come back to your school board this year on that clarity as this new metric is coming in that we'll be using this coming school year. And so use this as an opportunity to talk about this in a way you've never talked about it before, and why, even if you're out on college visits, completely acceptable if you're going to certain things that are engaging you and enriching you in some way. But if you're missing 18 days for that reason, that is still a problem. Right, 18 days to do any of those things is a challenge, and so you've got to think through your messaging and not fall into a trap there. We also tend to get feedback on, well, this is about truancy courts and how you know, our juvenile justice system is unfair across all of our districts. And so some courts are really strong in you know, how they define what truancy is, and some aren't. So that's actually not the focus of this conversation. The focus is the proactive measures that you can take to engage kids, particularly on the instruction side and the enrichment side, to make sure kids want to come to school, because our largest chronic absenteeism rates challenges fit in kindergarten. We see a real spike at kindergarten. We've got to build habits for families and kids, and then we see it again at 9th and 11th, 12th grade. We see those spikes again. Well, think about the engagement strategies, the instructional strategies that you need to have in place to be much more proactive in this work. And we're seeing some really bright spots across the state on how they've started to think about the proactive ways they approach it. I have had teachers on our own teacher advisory council say, well, I don't think this is a fair metric. I can't control it. And I will say, we would have never put this in here if we did not think you had an incredible impact on this particular metric. They need to hear that from us. And then I would tell them why. These are the things that you can do. This is what I'm seeing happening, back to your point, in some very key districts across the state that have taken this on. And so even with those challenges, and I wouldn't call it pushback, it's just I need to know more about this. We have had some really strong conversations around that proactive way we approach this work, and that your role, teacher, principal, superintendent, community member, it matters. And the more that we gather around the importance of being in school, and then quite frankly, what's happening during the school day that would make you want to come, the better we're going to get around the outcomes of this metric.
Candace, I think that's so helpful. Part of the challenge we've seen in the history of the work around attendance is that people see that as the role of the social worker, the truancy officer. It's those people over there that will take care of this. And what you're talking about is creating a whole new mindset to say this is a whole school community.
It's just your sign.
Sorry. A whole school community approach. And, you know, many of you have maybe seen our tiered pyramid of how you take a prevention-oriented approach. You can't do the bottom line of prevention without having all your teachers, your principals, everyone on board. Yep, go ahead.
I was going to add something that we found. Kindergarten is not mandatory in Mississippi, and so what we found happening were a lot of parents that were putting their kids in, and then they'll pull them out, and then they'll bring them in, then we'll pull them out. And because our data mirror Tennessee's in terms of kindergarten, and then 9th grade, and then 11th and 12th. So what we asked our legislature to do was, can you at least change the law that says, if you enroll in kindergarten, then you are under the mandatory attendance laws. And so that then made a big difference. If you're not going to make kindergarten mandatory, then at least make the attendance mandatory if they're enrolled. So that has been a way for us then to have a better way of tracking that data for those children that we know that are now enrolled and attending kindergarten. So I offer that as another suggestion, way we try to get at it.
Charlene, and I'm going to just say, I'm going to let Charlene speak, and then I'm actually going to see if we'll open up from the audience if there are questions.
And so, as I mentioned before, ESSA was really a culmination. What was into our plan was what we were already doing, and not something new and created for that purpose. On the draft that I know Cecilia did, for Connecticut, you'll see that we have arts access is there as well as physical fitness, back to this idea of well-rounded students. And so that's a part of the accountability system. And a couple of things I want to talk about. So this is really continuing the work that we've started. And on our website, not on the app, is a document, Accountability Guide for Results, because we really believe that's what it's all about. It's not just accountability for the sake of saying, we've got you, but how do we improve upon results? And if you want to learn more about our 12 indicators of school quality, that's a school accountability system, there is that guide, and every measure, there's a few pages that gives you the methodology, everything that you want to know about it, including resources, and that's how we want our districts to use that. Let me talk about data, not just our districts, but everyone. We want the community to be able to talk about this, and that's what we really try to do when we talk about the cross-sector report and the cross-sector work that's necessary. We really believe schools cannot do this alone. It's the school, the family, and the community working together. And so we've also implemented, it's called EdSite, if you go to our page, and it is our data portal. And what we're so pleased about, you can, from anywhere in the world, you can go into that portal and you could pull up a district, and you could uncover a school, and you can get the school chronic absence data. You can break it down by grade level. You can disaggregate it by race, ethnicities, students with disabilities, high needs, free lunch. You can actually have that data at your fingertips.
And you can see it for 5 years.
That's right. We have trend data. That's there. So when you talk about the Nike swoop, the higher in the early grades, and then it dips, and then it goes up at high school, you can actually do that for your school. And not just, yes, the school folks, but the community folks, the parents can actually go in and get this information. And so talking about using this to drive results, it changes the conversation. And so that is really important. So in tandem, so yes, we have ESSA. We're continuing to do that work. But we're driving this at all fronts and at all levels, because it really does take all of us, and it takes a team to do that. I like, John Maxwell has this quote in his book, The 17 Indisputable Laws of Teamwork. And law number 1 is the law of significance. And he basically said in that particular chapter that 1 is too small a number to achieve greatness. And I really believe that. If it's significant, it takes a team. And that truly is the approach that we're using. So the schools don't have to feel as if you're blaming us for what's going on, or we don't have control. We're basically saying, so who are your natural partners? Who are the families? Who are the community providers? And they're really lining up to make sure that they're there to support all our students. So ESSA for us is a continuation of the progress that we're trying to make, and then the driver for everyone around to say, yes, as I said before, unleashing the genius in our students require an effort for all of us to participate in.
I want to turn to the audience for a second. How many of you know whether chronic absence is in your either already posted or possible draft ESSA plans? So this is something, by the way, that if you don't know, it might be worth knowing, because it helps you to know. Although, as I just want to point out with Carrie's example, it's both, everyone is supposed to have it in their data that is going to be publicly available on state and local report cards. So in terms of an advocacy point, that's something that everyone can use. Some states, many states, are using it in the accountability discussion, and that's also a point for dialogue. I'd like to turn, anyone have questions about what they're doing, or are you seeing particular challenges or opportunities around ESSA that it might be helpful to share with anyone in the room? Yes, thank you.
Since this requires...
And why don't you say who you are?
I'm sorry, Jennifer Leonard, Rock the Future and the Community Foundation in Rochester, New York. and we have a good chronic absence program in the elementary grades, where we needed it. But it requires a level of sharing among the schools, their leadership, and their teachers that it seems to be hard to make happen. And I wondered if any of you had a magic way of getting schools to not just compete with each other, which also seems to work, but actually to share and pay attention to best practices from the other schools.
I'm going to jump in and immediately say, when you are being held accountable for it in some way, miraculously that starts happening. So I think that's one way, is just to say, what is the accountability around whatever it is, and then to provide an avenue for that kind of conversation and open it up. I think you made a great point of, here's a district that's doing this well. Like, point out where those bright spots are and encourage that type of networking and conversation across your districts. But accountability measures of some kind are needed, not just transparency. We're doing a lot of things that are transparency metrics that we're trying to get our data right before we would put it into an actual accountability metric. And while you might say, well, that will get people's attention, right? You're just posting it on your report card, you're just putting it out there on a transparency a model. It's not near as effective until you put it into some kind of a measure of accountability of some kind, right?
And let me add to that, because I think it is so true. Although I said we had years of reporting out the data, when it got into the accountability system, the phone calls kept coming in. The phones were ringing off the hook. Now with the superintendent saying, wait a minute, I need to know more about this, or the school counselor or the school psychologist calling and saying, my superintendent said I've got to fix this, right? So I need your assistance. So it really made a difference. Although I said we were doing this work, it got even a higher level of visibility and attention.
One other thing I'd suggest, even just to get the conversation started, and this is something I've been encouraging the superintendents to do, is to start these conversations in vertical articulation patterns. You know, if you've got, elementary schools that feed to middle schools that feed to high schools, that's a good chance to get your principals in a room and have this conversation around what are you seeing at the elementary schools that feed to the middle and middle to the high, so that, because these same families eventually end up there. So how are we engaging with them early on and providing them the help and the assistance that they need? Sometimes it's just getting the conversation started and being very clear about that, but you're exactly right. When you're holding people accountable, it raises the level of attention, but to at least get the conversation started, that's one thing I've been encouraging the superintendents to do.
I'd say also from a superintendent level.
There you go.
Clearly, I think the state role, is very important, and encourage, the work going on in these states, and Colorado is a similar part of our ESSA provision. But I think at a city level, at a school district level, yes, having attendance and the consequences of poor attendance, i.e. the dropout rate, be very much a part of your accountability system. Just for example, in Denver, and I'll say the second part of this is, it's really important that there be real-time publication and tracking and comparison and discussion of the data. So for example, we publish to all of our schools and to our school network leaders a weekly ABC stoplight report. And the ABC stoplight comes out of Johns Hopkins research. It's around attendance, behavior, course completion, right? Because those are such strong predictors of which students are going to stay on and graduate, which students are likely to drop out. And you guys both all made the point around attendance is critical, but also incidents around behavior and reducing suspensions. We've had remarkable results now. We've decreased our dropout rate in Denver by 70%, 70% over the last 8 or 9 years. When you think of that, there are 2,500 young men and women in Denver this year who didn't drop out, right? Who would have dropped out 8 or 9 years ago. And so yes, having consistency in the accountability policy, but even more important, giving people real-time, very visible data. And so our stoplight reports is a stoplight report because every kid in each of those 3 categories gets a green, yellow, or red based on how they're doing attendance, how they're doing if there are behavior incidents, how they're doing in terms of course completion. So as a school leader, not just a school leader, but as a school leadership team, you get that data report every week. And you can see where, where your trends are, where your challenges are. And then very much, this is an individual child, an individual family matter. How do you support? Because there are lots of reasons why kids have challenges. And how do you get that individual level of support for our students who are having challenges?
Okay, thank you. In the yellow?
I have a question.
And say who you are and where you're from. That allows us all to.
Kelly Butler, and I'm from the Carrie Wright State Institute.
Kelly.
I have a question about the paradox of that perhaps needs some reconciling between the issue of suspensions on the one hand, but our expectations about attendance on the other. And if we're seeing anything nationally around towards more meaningful behavioral kinds of approaches in schools that could ameliorate some of the need to suspend. In other words, are we seeing movement away from PBIS types of things towards conscious discipline that really gets at the root causes of behavior rather than just slapping a punishment?
I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit from a district level. I think absolutely. And those, your discipline policies and your attendance, results, and therefore your dropout rates and your graduation rates are inextricably linked. And so when we, have had this 70% decrease in our dropout rate, it's not coincidental that we've had a 75% decrease in our out-of-school suspensions, and a similar, actually slightly greater decrease in our expulsions. And that took an enormous shift in our attitudes around both discipline policies and supports for kids in the very early preventative stages. And I think, we as a state went through a very dark period a decade and a half ago with students being killed at Columbine High School here locally, and went through a real strong reaction around zero tolerance discipline policies. And we saw a very large spike in suspension and expulsions, and we saw that really affecting disproportionately our kids of color in this state. And so we had to sit down with our teachers, with our community, with our advocates to say, appreciate all the fears and where this comes from, the very real fears where this comes from, but we can't do this. The zero tolerance is not working. And to dramatically change to, one, a clearer discipline ladder that made very clear for any kind of behavior what the different consequences are, to take a lot of the subjectivity out of who gets suspended or who gets expelled. Be particularly conscious of some of the frequent areas of things like mouthing off or things like disruptive behavior. Those shouldn't be suspendable events. And to really go to a policy of restorative justice where kids are held to consequences, but that consequence is making whole the students or adults who they've harmed. That consequence is not going home to watch TV. And I think it's been a very challenging shift for us, but it's one I think that has had enormous results. I think it's also as part of that a real shift to trying to put in place in schools preventative resources. So we under the leadership of our school board, and want to really recognize our school board Vice President Barbara O'Brien, whose leadership has been so important in this. We went to the voters of Denver with a mill levy, a tax increase last fall. The biggest single component of that tax increase is supports for the whole child. And that's focused on how do we get more social and emotional supports for our kids. And that's several forms. One is form stronger social and emotional learning curricula, real sort of habits of success. We call personal success factors, other people might call character development, but really on a universal level for all of our kids, focus on the habits of success, the personal factors of success that really matter. But also then resourcing with counselors, with social workers, sometimes with physical health, so with nurses, with restorative practices coordinators, and focusing that equally on the elementary level, right? A recognition that so our social and emotional resource has been very disproportional on a secondary level, and we hadn't resourced the elementary level to the degree we needed to. So a real move to put much greater social and emotional support resource at the elementary level. And as part of that, again, under Barbara's leadership, we came out, our board came out this spring and said, we will no longer expel any student from K to 3. And we will only suspend children in cases where there's an immediate threat of violence or physical harm, and for that, for a maximum of 1 day. And our goal is to get to 0 suspensions at K3, 1, to keep those kids in school, but 2, to dramatically change the paradigm. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of culture and resources for teacher, but I think the school board's move to say, already our suspensions and expulsions were way under state averages, but to say, we're going to get to 0 on ECE through 3, and then set that tone and practice around restorative practices and keeping kids in school for all of our grades.
Charlene, you looking like you want to jump in there.
Just one quick thing, because I think that's a great question. And from the state level, something that we recognize that we needed to work on as well. So while school discipline is not a part of the ESSA large A accountability, it is a part of our report card and actually sits on a report card right next to attendance, because I think they are indeed connected. And so from the state level, we also do a huge annual report to our state board on school discipline, where we really look at the data at the state level from soup to nuts, really, and we're looking at what's going on there and how they are indeed connected. And so from the state level, what are we doing to assist districts with restorative practices? What are those kinds of things that we're doing? And we look at the data that shows, okay, so what are the incidences? And we're finding out a lot of school policy violation. All right, and so what does that look like? And we're working directly with districts around supporting them in addressing those particular issues. And across the board, I should say, I so appreciate that you've got a state board member here from Mississippi. The work in Connecticut is very much supported by our State Board of Education, whose comprehensive plan of education for 5 years, based on required in state law, is equity and excellence for all our students. And in that particular plan, discipline is addressed in making sure we can lower those numbers. The same thing for attendance, it's there, so that is a marker for making sure that we're doing this work, and we're doing it with the board's support and direction, which is important, as well as school-based arrests, which is another area that we have an initiative on, because that's the other thing that's happening as well, that we have a lot of our kids, disproportionately kids of color, who are being arrested. And so we have initiatives around that as well, and helping districts to be supported around moving the dial in that area.
I want to shift the dialogue just a little bit, because I think some of what also happens and why kids end up being having behavioral challenges in schools also connects to mental health, health-related supports, and our ability to actually take a much more interagency approach. And I want to turn for a moment to Candace, because I've been so impressed by the way you have kind of a coordinated school health system in Tennessee. And I also know that you're doing quite a bit about trauma-informed, that's not just in Tennessee, but could you say a little bit more about how do you promote interagency approach?
Sure. We see the direct connection between our health outcomes and education outcomes, and are really trying to connect the dots across all of our community agencies around this particular issue. But we are, I believe, the only state, I've been told, that has coordinated school health coordinators in every single one of our districts that are a network of individuals who focus solely on health. everything from mental health. They help us with some statewide data gathering on, are we making improvements in certain areas? Where should we put our resources as we think about resource allocations every year? They also help us with challenges that we have in our state around obesity, particularly in a lot of our rural counties, and how are we as a state agency and our health department in particular thinking about the health outcomes related to obesity. So there's some state goals that they are also connected to. The area that I would say is a fairly new work for us within the last year and a half is our ACEs work, our Adverse Childhood Experiences work. And what I love about this work is that this is being led by our governor and first lady, and that has made all the difference in how it's being perceived across a fairly red state. That doesn't necessarily sometimes come to this as the very first area that we should be thinking about. But we have now said from a perspective of a Republican governor and a fairly Republican state, you know what, this is one of our first priorities now, is to make sure that mental health and the work around how do we approach students in our agencies, our DCS, DHS, what do we do in education that's actually helping improve the challenges that students are bringing with them, as opposed to continuing a process of not, opposite of restorative justice. We actually use it as a lever to move them farther and farther away from our goal. What we have done specifically is every state agency, legislators, our judges, they're being trained in these practices around the ACEs work. And again, they're doing that because the governor has said, you're gonna do it. And so across all of these agencies, folks are preparing to work with students in different ways than they have in the past. We made it the whole work around ACEs as a core piece of even rolling out our absenteeism, discipline work as a state, to say, we're not just gonna roll this out as an accountability measure. We're going to actually support you in different ways. So we have statewide restorative justice work that we're doing, as well as this ACEs work that's going across all of our state agencies and state government at this point. What we have done is to actually look at the brain research around what does happen to the way a child approaches certain things when they have had multiple traumatic experiences in their life. And being in poverty is a traumatic experience in and of itself. We also have statewide poverty simulations that we actually stole from one of our larger school districts. Metro Nashville Schools has done poverty simulations with groups of teachers, student teachers in particular, as well as community groups, to actually go through a 4-hour exercise of what is it like if you are working with someone who has been in poverty for potentially their whole life, and generational poverty, and how would we approach that work differently than what we've been doing. That has been a real change. There's been a change in our state in how we talk about this, and this is not about this is your fault, but this is work that we all have to take seriously. It's changing a lot of how we think about our work specifically, what we have as priorities, and I will say that is everywhere from state legislators to state board members to teachers in the classroom. It's really a statewide effort at this point.
Charlene or Carrie, would you add anything else to what does it mean to take an interagency approach to this work?
Well, we've just kind of begun that, to be honest with you, over the past, I'm going to say maybe 18 months to 2 years, in a very small way. In fact, I'm not even sure how many people across the state even realize that this Child Health Council exists. But it was our first effort to get all of the state agency heads in one room on a regular basis. So it's the Department of Health, it's the head of pediatrics at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, it's the head of one of the other evaluation centers, it's the head of policy, it's Medicaid is now at the table, the agency head for Medicaid, and mental health. And so we meet, have been meeting on a regular basis, and it was really kind of through our conversations and even the plans that we've even got moving forward, but in a way that we could all ensure that we were all speaking the same language, and how then can we connect our agencies in a much more powerful way. Because obviously, if somebody is involved with well, everybody, all children, obviously, with my agency some way or another, but if there's a child that's involved with health, obviously, there's probably somebody else that needs to be involved with Medicaid, and even how are we leveraging Medicaid dollars to further the work that needs to be done with children in school and with families writ large. So it's a group of very dedicated people. We're also looking at, we talked about, Tom was talking about this early kind of piece with children, and we're looking to even apply for a grant that will give us the ability to do developmental screenings at a very early age across the entire state. North Carolina, I think right now is screening somewhere, I want to say close to 80% of all those kids at that age level, and we are so not there as a state. And you all know, and I'm speaking to, obviously, to the choir, the earlier the intervention for these children, the better. So that's the next piece that we've been kind of working on as agency heads, but to impact the state, but impact the state in a very comprehensive manner.
One of the things, and I'm reminded of this because Danielle Ewan is in the back of the room, and Danielle and I have been talking a lot about how if you see high levels of kindergarten chronic absence, it could be, in fact, used as a lever for wanting to explore what's happening before you get to kindergarten. Yes. Because the challenge is it a reflection of unmet developmental needs? Is it a reflection of the lack of access to early childhood programming? You could use that because chronic absence is going to be one of the data metrics that's available for the youngest kids, but then use that to actually start thinking about that whole continuum. Charlene?
So the idea of an interagency approach, and what I'd encourage you to do, is to take a look at existing structures that may be in place that you can leverage. We have, in the legislature, we have an interagency council on ending the achievement gap in Connecticut. And that is co-chaired by our lieutenant governor. And all state agencies, just about all our state agencies, sit around that table. So we have commissioners and other high agency officials that participate. Now, we've leveraged the work on school health. We've leveraged the work on chronic absence to be in that space. So imagine the power of having all your leaders of all your other agencies around the table when we're having these conversations, so we can have a systems approach to what it is that we're trying to do. That was chronicled in law. I mentioned about having law where chronic absence is in state law. That particular piece of legislation, Public Act 15-233, I think it is, 15-225, also required, and another shameless plug, but it's in your app, a guide, required the department to develop a guide on reducing chronic absence in Connecticut schools, a prevention and intervention guide. And the law required that be done in collaboration with the Interagency Council. So literally, we were developing this guide. The lieutenant governor was a part of vetting and providing feedback along with all other state agencies. So it is really important, but as I said, you may not have that per se, but what else do you have that's a part of state law? Everyone's busy and we're working in silos that you can bring together, that you can leverage for this particular work that I think is so really important.
Tom, talk a little bit about how this work that we've discussed connects, or maybe you might think about its implications and connections to the other things that you're also doing on early literacy here in Denver.
Great. So thank you. And I think it really does connect. And I think that one of our experiences has been just the importance of partnership at the state level and at the city and community level here. And obviously, we have very, very strong leadership from our school board around early literacy. In Barbara, in her role as head of the children's campaign, and then as lieutenant governor, and now vice president of the school board, has just relentlessly championed early literacy and the importance of these partnerships. I also want to call out Lisa Roy, who's our head of early literacy, who in a former life spearheaded a remarkable effort along with Dave Youngren, who's also here from the Gary Community Investment Foundation. The notion of having a citywide preschool program where we'd raise a city tax and have that tax pay for preschool programs across district-run schools, charter schools, and community-based preschool providers that would be based on the need of students and the quality of the program. There's a wonderful opportunity for us to come together as a community on this and go from a situation where, a decade ago, far fewer than half our kids were in full-day kindergarten. Now all of them are, and 1 in 8 of our kids were in full-day, 4-year-olds were in full-day preschool, and now over 90% of them are. So, an example of those partnerships. I think we've continued that. We formed jointly with the city a 0 to 8 roadmap, a birth date roadmap, where we're really saying the importance of grade level reading doesn't start just in kindergarten, right? It starts when kids are born, and how we support their parents and how we support the kids in earliest age. And again, that's work that we as a district have fundamental role in, but also so does the city, and so do our community partners. So how can we come together in a set of partnership to meet the needs of kids across 0 to 8? And then I'd also say, again, another connection here, we've talked about the importance of attendance and what that means to support our kids in early reading. You guys gave a number of strong data connections. And again, that's why we have focused very intently on early literacy, right? We've said the single biggest area that we're going to focus on academically is early literacy. Last summer, we brought not only every single elementary school teacher, but also all of our elementary school paras in for a whole week around early literacy, but then throughout the course of the school year, differentiated that, where every school has a teacher leader who teaches half-time, and the other half-time coaches and supports early literacy teachers in his or her building. And we work very closely with those teacher leader early literacy specialists to give them intensive professional development training that they then take back to their buildings and do on a very differentiated basis. Because most of our teachers tell us that they learn a lot more from teacher leaders in their buildings than they learn from the terrific folks who we have at the district level in offering professional learning. So really trying to differentiate that. The results aren't public yet, but I'm thrilled to see this year we had double-digit gains in our percentage of K-3 students reading at grade level. They're the biggest gains we've ever seen in DPS. But importantly, again, and tied in here, the academics don't sit alone. They sit as part of a whole child approach for our kids. And we talked about our tax increase. Again, the biggest single piece was focus on the whole child. Second biggest piece is actually supporting our teacher leaders. The third biggest piece is early literacy. And importantly, with those monies, we dramatically targeted them. We have a very decentralized funding formula in Denver where money follows the kid, and schools are really empowered. And schools have a tremendous amount of flexibility as to how they use their dollars to decide how they want to fund class sizes, interventions, specials, tutoring. All those things are school-based decisions. But what we said was this money, for every $1 that a student who's not eligible for free or reduced lunch gets, $4 will follow every student who's eligible for free and reduced lunch. So it means, for example, in early literacy, schools don't get the same amount of dollars. Schools that serve higher poverty kids get 2 to 3 times the amount of dollars that more affluent schools get. And again, every school gets resources, that's important. But our higher poverty schools need the resources more. And what those resources pay for is more time for teacher learning, more time for kids, more opportunities to do smaller group instruction and tutoring for kids as well. And likewise on the social emotional side. Our higher poverty schools get significantly more resources to hire counselors, social workers, restorative justice practice coordinators. And again, I think just this extraordinarily important notion of when attacking early literacy, yes, you've got to attack it, the academic part, because the extraordinary level of skill and differentiating that's needed for our teachers to teach well, but to do that nested in a set of whole child and social and emotional supports for our kids, including, for example, the changes in our discipline policy, and to do so in a way that's really targeted. We have enormous opportunity gaps in Denver based on the racial and ethnic background of our kids as well as income. And those aren't going to close unless we dramatically change and target our resources and our practices to give better opportunities to kids who haven't had the kinds of opportunities they deserve. Because I think, as Charlene said, right, our job is to make sure the genius in every child, the talent in every child, has a chance to be realized.
Absolutely. You know, I think this is where this is similar to the thinking about chronic absence. There's a number of ways to try to think about how do you target resources. So poverty is absolutely a key indicator. It is, you know, it's that whole shift from equality to equity. It's not equal allocation, it's equitable allocation. And part of when we start thinking about the guidance that and advice we might give to funders, I think, aside from finding out whether chronic absence is in your report cards, because once you, and in your states, because once you start knowing that how that is going to be publicly available, you can start to make sure you're using the data and thinking about who needs resources the most. One of the things that we really think it's important to go out with in this era is making sure that folks understand that chronic absence can be used as a diagnostic for identifying and addressing barriers to learning. And I actually would combine it also with information that you might have on poverty income. I will also say there are a lot of places I know where the free and reduced lunch price data is not so good. Families don't like, as a parent of kids in public schools, I hate that form. I can see why parents might not fill it in, and so it means that we sometimes have undercounts. So you can also use census data, other things, but when you use this, because I will also say one of my biggest fears as we move in this era of greater information about chronic absence is that we're moving that into an environment where still so many people think that when kids have poor attendance, it's a sign that their families don't care, and we need to go and take legal action as a first, not a last resort, when that's extremely expensive, not proven to be the best way. You can take legal action effectively. It's just not the first thing that you do. You start with prevention, using resources, finding out what the challenges are and the barriers are, and then taking action. But we have to go to scale in a country where chronic absence is now going to be publicly available in every state in the country. And the question is, when people see that data, see high levels of chronic absence, will they use it well? As funders, you have an incredibly important role to help make sure that that data is used to support and nurture the most vulnerable children and high poverty schools, not penalize them. This is about providing supports, not creating, and I know that Carrie thinks about a finger-pointing blame game, because that will not change outcomes. So you can also convene stakeholders to review data and create solutions. As funders, you're in a unique position. I have to say, you know, I once was a program officer, and the thing that I was most helpful was whenever I wanted to talk to anyone, they would always come, right? It's the benefits of being a program officer. You can get them in the room. Now, whether they stay and continue to the work may depend on whether or not they really find value, but bringing people into the room, that's not usually a challenge for most funders. You can also figure out who are key grantees, who authentically see this as about the work. You know, Attendance Works has maybe 7, 8 people, if you added us all together on a very, very good day. The reason we've been able to work at scale is because we have so many partners, many of whom are in this room, who champion this work themselves, and grantees. I'm looking at Angela, I'm looking at Terry, that's why this work has, and Cynthia, you know, you all move this work out in your own ways. And when you find grantees who authentically want that and support that, You know, Rhode Island has made this work because you've got it in Rhode Island Kids Count, and they've motivated people on the ground to do that work. So you all can find your local grantees who can move this work. And then you can help to build the public awareness, understanding, and a real sense of urgency about how you can do this. I want to actually take a moment to recognize one very important funder. And we had a chance, by the way, so if you want more, on your app is also a funder brief that we wrote that you're welcome to take a look at. And then what I'd actually like to do is take a moment. Ralph encouraged us to use this moment to actually acknowledge and recognize a particularly important funder who, for us, has just played such a catalytic role, and that is Jim Williamson, who is not here, but Jolene, who is the Director of Community Initiatives. Jolene, can you please come up? Is here, and the reason, so this is the New Britain story that, I know we'll have to do pictures eventually, Jolene, but let me say for a moment why we wanted to recognize Jim Williamson, who's the president of the Community Foundation of Greater New Britain, as a catalyst for change. And I also want to recognize that there are other folks from New Britain who've been here and who are in part of this session. Oh, we have to move this up. I'm hearing that. Because we have Kim Rousseau, who is also with us. Yay, Kim. Because this has really been a community effort. And the work in New Britain, as Charlene mentioned, was happening in parallel. New Britain was with Jim's support, had a catalytic influence on the work. What Jim used was he helped to use the resources of the foundation first to make sure that New Britain looked at its data. And when New Britain looked at its data, it did not know that they had an incredibly high chronic absence level. It was 30% in kindergarten when they first looked at that data. And then Jim and the foundation used their leadership to convene key stakeholders, the city, community partners, to bring everyone around the table to take a look at what was this problem, what were the barriers, and how do you address it? And as you've already heard from Charlene's example, this has had ripple effects throughout the state. And now that we have a proof point state with 3 years of reductions, it is having ripple effects throughout the country. Jim serves as an inspiring example of how philanthropy, especially a local community foundation, can have an enduring impact on improving outcomes for children. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jolene.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you very much.
You want to say any words?
Sure. Well, thank you all. This is such an honor for us.
And I think that microphone may not be
Okay, so we'll use this one, because if we are anything, we are flexible. Is that working? Yes, okay. Jim has always been visionary in our work and at the foundation. And he had the foresight in 2011 to bring Hetty to New Britain at a time when, as she mentioned, chronic absenteeism really wasn't on the map. But we learned very quickly that our rate was 19.1%, which was nearly double the state average. And when we brought Hetty in 2011 with our first grant, New Britain really was ready for this work. And as a result, chronic absenteeism among students in grades K through 3 has dropped by nearly 45% since we began this work. So while we thank Jim for his vision and for his foresight, we equally and especially need to thank those in the trenches doing this work. Those from the coalition, Robin is here, Kim and Tracy are in the room, the leadership from the school district who will be joining us later, Nancy Serra, the superintendent, Joe Varachak, et cetera. Of course, the administrators and the parents who are willing to really dive in and do this work, and of course the students who showed up. So that is always a wonderful thing. So on behalf of Jim and also New Britain as a whole, We thank everybody here for this honor and this award. It truly is meaningful, and I hope that the work that we have done, which has gotten us some statewide recognition and national recognition, will help you all in your work as you go forth. So thank you again so much.
So as you can see, truly an example of what it means to be a catalyst for change. And with that, I'm going to actually ask you all to open up your apps. And you got to open up the GLR Week app. You got to open up your funder huddle, right? And then you're going to go to this session, and you're going to be, so pulling out, you can pretend the opening plenary actually says this session, and you're going to pull up the takeaway question so that you can then help give us feedback, give us insights about what are the takeaway insights that you got from this session so that we can also have a lasting record of what you're thinking and use that information to continue to inform the dialogue that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading seeks to facilitate among funders. And with that, let me truly thank my amazing panel over here, offering us their deep insights about what it takes to move this work on the ground.